Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind the screen, past the painted faces, the silk kimono, the perfectly poured tea, and into the real, complicated, breathtakingly strange world of the geisha. Not the Hollywood version, not the mysterious porcelain doll draped in myth and misunderstanding. I mean the actual women, the ones who woke up at dawn, trained until their fingers bled, navigated a world of impossible social rules, and somehow made it all look effortless. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuine, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You have no idea how much it means when someone takes the time to write in. It shapes what this channel becomes, and I'm grateful for every single suggestion. If you haven't already, the channel is now on Spotify too, so if you'd rather drift off to this in your earbuds, the link is in the description. Now, dim the lights, flip on a fan for that soft white noise, pull your blanket up, and get settled. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to become a geisha? Did they choose this life? Or did the life choose them? What did they eat for breakfast before a 12-hour day of being perfect? Did they ever get to just sit in comfortable clothes and complain about their week? Was there a moment when a trainee thought, I can't do this anymore? And if so, what happened next? Could you have survived the training, the memorization, the walking, the bowing, the endless, exacting performance of grace without once stress-eating something deeply undignified? And what happened when the lights went out, the guests went home, and it was just a woman and her thoughts in a very quiet room? Congratulations, you've just woken up in Kyoto. The year is somewhere in the early 18th century. You're 12 years old, you don't know anyone here, and the woman at the door is already correcting your posture. Let's start at the very beginning. Not with training, not with silk, but with the world itself. The Hanamachi, or Flower Town, was the specific district of Kyoto where geisha culture took root and bloomed into something almost self-contained. You didn't stumble into a Hanamachi by accident. These were tight-knit neighborhoods, Yon being the most famous, where okiya, geisha houses, tea houses, and rehearsal spaces clustered together along narrow stone-paved lanes, lined with wooden majiya townhouses. Everything was deliberate, everything had its place. If you were a young girl arriving here for the first time, you would have noticed the quiet immediately. Not peaceful quiet, but purposeful quiet. The kind that tells you there are rules operating just below the surface that nobody has explained to you yet, but that everyone around you seems to already know. The streets of Gion were not wide. They were not meant to be. Wide streets invited strangers, invited noise, invited the kind of casual passerby who had no business being there. The Hanamachi was designed to discourage the accidental visitor and reward the initiated one. Stone lanterns glowed at dusk. Latticed wooden facades gave nothing away. You could walk past the entrance to a tea house 100 times and still not know it was there, unless someone who belonged to this world showed you exactly where to look. The architecture was its own form of discretion, beautiful, closed, and entirely intentional. The neighborhood operated on its own schedule. In the early morning it looked like any other Kyoto street. Quiet, a little cold, someone sweeping a step. But by late afternoon things began to shift. Shamisen notes drifted from upper windows. Women in kimono moved through the lanes with a particular focused walk of people who were late for something important and weren't about to show it. The sound of a drum being practiced, the same 3 beats, over and over, with the patience of someone who had accepted that repetition was the entire lesson, would follow you down the block long after you'd turned the corner. 5 major Hanamachi existed in Kyoto, each with its own character. Gionkobu was the most prestigious, the most formal, the one visitors meant when they said Gion and imagined all of it at once. Pontocho ran along a narrow alley beside the Kamogawa River, famous for its summer restaurants that extended wooden platforms over the water. Kameshichiken was older and quieter, the kind of neighbourhood that didn't feel the need to explain itself. Each district had its own roster of tea houses, its own community of okiya, its own annual dance performance, and its own subtle culture of rivalry with the others, friendly on the surface, because everything in this world was friendly on the surface. To live inside a hanamachi was to live inside a system. The system had rules about what you wore and when, which tea houses you were permitted to enter, and which were above your current standing, who you greeted first on the street, and how deeply you bowed when you did it. A senior geisha passed you on a lane, and you stopped, you bowed, you waited. She acknowledged you, or she didn't, and either outcome told you exactly where you stood that day. There were no arguments, there were no scenes. There was only the careful management of status performed in the key of politeness, which, if you grew up in it, was as natural as breathing, and if you arrived from outside it, was the most exhausting thing you'd ever attempted to learn. This was your world now. These lanes, these tea houses, these rules. The city of Kyoto existed beyond the Hanamachi's edges, and you would move through it sometimes for errands, for temple visits, for the specific kind of public appearance that required being seen outside the flower town as much as within it. But the Hanamachi was the centre. Everything radiated out from it, and everything eventually came back. You were a long way from wherever you came from, and the distance was not measured in miles. Your first real lesson in geisha life wasn't about dance or music or tea, it was about money. The okiya, the geisha house that would take you in, feed you, clothe you and train you, was also, let's be extremely clear about this, the institution that owned your debt. Every kimono, every lesson, every grain of rice you ate was logged against your name in a ledger, and that ledger would follow you for years. The okiya was run by the okasan, meaning mother, a woman who was usually a retired geisha herself, and who managed the household with a kind of calm, terrifying efficiency that suggested she had seen everything before and been impressed by very little of it. This was not a foster home. It was a business arrangement wearing the clothes of a family. The okiya was a narrow building, typically 2 or 3 stories, squeezed into a row of other narrow buildings on a quiet lane. Downstairs, the common rooms, the practice spaces, the kitchen. Upstairs, the sleeping quarters, shared without exception, because private rooms were not a feature of this life at any stage of it. You learned quickly that the concept of personal space in an okiya was theoretical. You were surrounded by women at every hour, older geisha getting ready for evening engagements, younger trainees rehearsing in corners, the okasan moving through it all with the proprietorial calm of someone who was simultaneously the mother, the manager, and the bank. The debt system worked like this. When an okiya took in a girl, particularly in earlier centuries, when families sometimes sold daughters outright, the cost of that transaction became the foundation of the debt. On top of it, accumulated years of training fees, lessons in dance, shamisen, singing, tea ceremony, flower arranging, and the various other arts that a geisha was expected to perform. Add to that the cost of kimono, which were not modest, and the cost of the elaborate accessories that went with them, and the fees owed to the tea houses and the daily living expenses, and you began to understand why clearing the debt took as long as it did. The system wasn't designed to trap exactly, but it wasn't designed to hurry either. The okasan's authority over the household was absolute, in the way that authority becomes absolute when it is expressed entirely through reasonableness. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She observed, she evaluated, and she decided which engagements you attended, which clients you were assigned to, which of your behaviours required a quiet conversation, and which required only a look. A look from an okasan who had been running a house for 20 years communicated more than a paragraph could, and everyone in the building understood it immediately. In return for everything it demanded, the Okiya offered something real: protection, structure, and a pathway into a world that was otherwise completely closed. You could not simply present yourself to a Kyoto tea house and request to perform. You needed the Okiya's backing, the Okasan's network, the institutional weight of a house with a reputation behind you. The flower and willow world did not accept walk-ins. It accepted women who had been vetted, trained, and formally introduced by someone already inside it. The debt, when you thought about it in a certain way, was also the price of admission to something extraordinary. This didn't make it less of a debt, but it meant that the women paying it were not simply victims of an exploitative structure. They were participants in a specific bargain, whose terms they understood better than any outside observer, and whose complexity resisted the clean narratives that made it easier to explain at a distance. The ledger sat on the Okasan's desk. It was always accurate, and it waited, patiently, for every single entry to be addressed. Before a girl was a maiko, before the white face paint, before the elaborate hair, before anyone paid attention to her at all, she was a shikomi, a live-in servant, not a trainee in the glamorous sense, not a student gliding elegantly through rehearsal rooms. A shikomi cleaned. She cooked, she ran errands, she woke up before everyone else and went to sleep after everyone else, and she did this for months, sometimes years, before anyone decided she was ready to move forward. Think of it as a probationary period in which the probation involved scrubbing floors and being invisible. The idea was partly practical. You needed to absorb the rhythms of the Okiya before you could perform in them, and partly, frankly, about establishing exactly where you stood in the hierarchy, which was at the bottom, looking up. The shikomi woke before the household stirred. The fire needed starting. The floors needed sweeping. The entranceway, the genkan, the first thing any visitor saw, needed to be immaculate, because an immaculate genkan told a visitor everything about the standard of the house before a single word was exchanged. You swept it. Then you swept it again, because the first sweep was practice, and the second sweep was the actual standard. If the Okasan noticed the genkan, that was bad. The only correct outcome was that she didn't notice it at all, because it was simply unremarkably perfect. Meals in an Okiya ran on a schedule that had nothing to do with hunger. You ate when there was time between tasks, at whatever temperature the food had reached by then. In the evenings, when the senior geisha were dressing for engagements, a process requiring attention, assistance, and the kind of focused spatial awareness that came from months of practice. You were there, holding things, retrieving things, staying out of the way while simultaneously being available the moment you were needed. This was a skill. It had a name in Japanese contexts: reading the air, or kuki wo yomu. The ability to sense what was needed before it was asked for was not optional. It was the minimum. The training that happened during the shikomi period was not the formal kind. Nobody sat you down and taught you to play the shamisen during these months. What you were learning was less defined and more fundamental. The grammar of the Okiya. Which rooms were used for what? Which hours belonged to silence, and which permitted conversation? How to move through a space without disturbing the people in it? How to address the okasan, the senior geisha, the visiting clients, and the delivery man at the back door. 4 different registers of language and deference, all correct for their specific context, and all wrong if applied to the wrong person. What kept girls going through the shikomi period was, depending on the account you read, a combination of genuine love for the art they were training toward, the social and financial reality that there was nowhere else to go, and the human capacity to normalize almost any circumstances once they become routine. You stopped noticing how early you woke up. You stopped measuring the gap between what you were doing and what you had imagined doing. You focused on the next task, the next hour, the next correct performance of an ordinary thing that was being silently evaluated at all times. Some girls didn't make it through. They went home, or couldn't go home, or found other arrangements. The ones who stayed were not necessarily the toughest or the most talented. They were the ones who understood, at some level, that this was the foundation, and that foundations are always invisible, always unglamorous, and always the thing that everything else depends on. You were building something. It didn't look like anything yet. But the Genkan was spotless, and the Okasan had not mentioned it, and tomorrow you would do it again. At some point, if you survived the Shikomi years, you were assigned a Neonisan, an older geisha, who would become your big sister, your mentor, your walking instruction manual, and in some ways your entire social identity for the next several years. This relationship was not casual. You followed her to engagements. You watched how she moved, how she spoke, how she held a fan, how she laughed without laughing too much. You studied her the way a graduate student studies a dissertation, except the dissertation was a living woman who was simultaneously performing for clients, while also silently evaluating your every breath. The Onisan system was the invisible architecture that held the whole world together, passing knowledge not through books, but through imitation, proximity, and an awful lot of quiet observation in rooms where you were not technically allowed to speak unless spoken to. The formal ceremony binding Onisan and younger sister Imuto was called Sansankudo, the same ritual exchange of sake cups used in Japanese wedding ceremonies. This was not a coincidence. The relationship was being given the same sacred weight as a marriage, because in terms of its practical consequences, it was at least as binding. You were now tied to this woman. Her reputation influenced yours. Her connections opened doors for you. Her failures, if she had any, cast a shadow you walked in whether you wanted to or not. You chose each other, in theory. In practice, the Okasan often had a strong opinion about who belonged with whom, and the Okasan's strong opinion had a way of becoming the outcome. In the Ozashiki, the arrangement between Onisan and Imuto was educational theatre. The younger girl sat, watched, and occasionally assisted, pouring drinks, retrieving items, performing the small supportive acts that kept the evening moving while the senior woman did the primary work of entertainment. This was learning by immersion. Nobody narrated what was happening. Nobody paused to explain why the Onisan had changed the subject at that particular moment, or why she'd laughed at that specific joke in that particular way, or why she'd shifted her seat when she did. You watched, you filed it away, and you understood, slowly, over dozens of evenings, what the decisions had been and why they were correct. The Onisan was also your social passport. In a world that ran entirely on personal introduction and vouched reputation, being seen with an established geisha meant something. Tea houses that might have been cautious about taking on an unknown quantity were reassured by the older woman's presence. Clients who might have been uncertain how to interact with a very new Maiko took their cues from the senior figure beside her. Your Onisan's behaviour set the register for the evening, and your job was to operate within it without either lagging so far behind that you seemed lost or advancing so far forward that you seemed presumptuous. The relationship outlasted the formal mentorship period. Geisha, who had been sisters in this sense, often remained close for decades, attending each other's performances, maintaining the social obligations that the original ceremony had created, occasionally navigating the specific tension of two women in the same professional world who'd once been in an explicitly hierarchical relationship and now needed to operate as peers. Some of these relationships were, by every account, genuinely warm, the kind of friendship built from shared difficulty and mutual respect that doesn't require much maintenance because the foundation was laid so deep it doesn't move. Some were more complicated. The Hanamachi had a long memory and very little tolerance for airing the complication publicly, so most of it stayed exactly where it belonged. Between the two women who knew what had actually happened, in rooms the rest of the world never saw. Let's talk about the kimono, because the kimono was never just clothing. It was a communication system. The colours, the patterns, the way it was tied, the length of the collar at the back, all of it broadcast information about who you were, what stage of training you were in, what season it was, what occasion you were attending, and how much money had been spent on you. A maiko's kimono was long, with heavily trailing sleeves and an obi, the wide sash at the waist, tied in an elaborate dangling knot at the back that could take 30 minutes to arrange correctly, and cost more than most people earned in a month. Getting dressed was not a solo act. It was a collaborative project requiring at minimum one other set of hands, a great deal of patience, and an attitude of deep personal commitment to the process. The kimono itself was made from silk, hand-dyed, hand-embroidered in many cases, created specifically for the person wearing it, according to measurements that accounted not just for height and width, but for the precise proportions of neck, shoulder, and wrist that determined how the garment would fall and move. A kimono made to the wrong measurements didn't just look bad, it moved wrong, sat wrong, and communicated to anyone who knew what they were looking at that something was off. In the flower and willow world, having something be off was not a small matter. It was the entire matter. Seasonal rotation was non-negotiable. Silk weight shifted with the calendar. Lined kimono in winter, unlined in summer, a transitional weight in spring and autumn. Pattern choices followed the seasons so closely that wearing the wrong flower in the wrong month was a social error on the order of showing up to a formal dinner in a swimsuit, technically your own business, but something everyone would remember. Wisteria belonged to late spring, chrysanthemums to autumn. Wearing them outside their season was not expressiveness or individuality. It was incorrectness, and incorrectness in a world built entirely on correctness was a statement nobody wanted to make. The obi was a separate and equally demanding subject. For a full geisha, the obi was tied in a specific knot. The taiko, the drum, a neat flat bow sitting squarely on the back that required a particular wrapping technique and enough length of fabric to construct what amounted to a small architectural installation around your midsection. For a maiko, the obi was longer, more elaborate, the knot trailing down the back in a cascade of fabric that announced junior status at a glance. Learning to tie it correctly, and eventually to help tie it on others, was months of practice. Getting it wrong meant someone fixed it for you, silently, with the particular silence of a correction that didn't require comment. Underneath all of this, and there was a great deal of underneath, were multiple layers of underlining garments, each one adding structure and shape and a specific contribution to what the whole finally looked like from the outside. The collar of the innermost layer, visible at the back of the neck, was white for a full geisha and red and white for a maiko, a small detail that communicated an enormous amount of information to anyone in the room who understood the language. And in the Hanamachi, everyone understood the language. You were wearing your entire resume, your current status, your aesthetic sensibility, and your seasonal awareness all at once, every single time you got dressed. Getting dressed, in this light, was less like putting on clothes and more like making a very public argument about who you were. You'd better be sure you were right. You've seen the image: white face, red lips, dark eyes, a slash of bare skin at the back of the neck. But the makeup of a geisha, particularly a maiko in training, had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with transformation. The white base, traditionally made from rice powder, and before that from lead, which is a sentence that should alarm you, was not meant to make a girl look pretty. It was meant to make her look like something other than herself. The face paint was a kind of mask, separating the performer from the person, the role from the woman inside it. The nape of the neck left deliberately bare. That single strip of unpainted skin was considered, within this world, one of the most quietly devastating things a woman could show a man. In a culture where everything else was covered, calculated and controlled, that small patch of ordinary skin was the whole show. Applying the white base was a process, not a moment. First, a layer of oil or wax was applied to the face to help the powder adhere. Then the white liquid, thick, chalky, deeply covering, was applied from the chest up to the hairline with a brush in deliberate strokes that had to be even and smooth and leave no trace of the individual beneath. The hairline itself was left with a precise unpainted border, giving the white expanse a defined edge that looked almost too perfect to be real. In a certain quality of light, and geisha were exquisitely aware of what different lights did, the painted face achieved something genuinely otherworldly. A stillness, a formality, a sense that you were looking at a form of art that was also a person, or a person that was also a form of art. The lips came next, and here there was a distinction between Maiko and full geisha. A junior Maiko painted only her lower lip in red, leaving the upper lip white. A more senior Maiko painted both lips, but in a simplified small shape, contained and deliberate. A full geisha, once she'd completed her training, often wore less white altogether, thinner coverage, sometimes none, because her skill was no longer something that needed announcing. The transformation that paint performed for a Maiko was gradually replaced, as training deepened, by the transformation of actual expertise. You stopped needing the mask when you became the thing the mask was pointing at. The eyes were outlined in black, and the eyebrows, painted over the natural ones which were shaved or simply covered, were drawn in either red or black depending on rank and occasion. These painted eyebrows sat slightly higher than natural ones, giving the face a permanent expression that read as composed, attentive, and mildly surprised by something interesting. This was, in its way, useful. A face that looked perpetually mildly surprised by something interesting was a face that communicated availability, for conversation, for performance, for whatever the evening required. Taking the makeup off at the end of the night was its own ritual, done in a specific order with specific cloths, leaving the face gradually returning to itself layer by layer. There is something useful to know here. Geisha described the removal of the white face as a private experience, a moment between the performance and the person that belonged to nobody else. You put the mask on in company and you took it off alone. Whatever you were after, the white face came off, tired, relieved, younger looking than anyone outside the Hanamachi would have guessed. Occasionally something other than fine was yours. The painted face was what the world saw. The undecorated face was what the mirror knew, and in the Hanamachi the mirror kept its own counsel. The world geisha inhabited had a name, the Karukai, the flower and willow world, and understanding it requires letting go of almost every Western assumption about what it was. This was not a red light district. This was not a brothel operating under a prettier name. The Karukai was a licensed entertainment world with its own strict internal economy, social hierarchy, legal framework and artistic culture that had been developing since at least the 17th century. Within it, geisha were professional performers, musicians, dancers, conversationalists who were compensated for their time and their art. The confusion between geisha and sex work was, in many ways, the result of a separate class of women called oiran, and later yujo, who did engage in licensed prostitution, and whose world existed in parallel but was technically, sometimes barely, sometimes quite clearly distinct. The name itself was poetic in the way that Japanese aesthetic naming often is, not decorative poetry but functional poetry, the kind that does actual descriptive work. Flowers here meant the geisha, beautiful, carefully cultivated and operating within a specific season. Willows meant the quality of their art, flexible, resilient, bending without breaking. Together, the image conjured a world of graceful living things that existed within a structure of considerable constraint, which was more or less exactly right. The Karyukai was not freedom, but it was not simple captivity either. It was something more complicated than either of those, which is perhaps why it has always resisted tidy description. Historically, the Karyukai grew from the licensed entertainment districts of Edo period Japan, the pleasure quarters that the Tokugawa government established and regulated to contain and control the social instabilities it associated with certain kinds of leisure. Within these districts, a clear division of labour was supposed to exist. The yujo, or licensed, prostitutes, provided sexual services. The entertainers, shamisen players, dancers, women who made the evening feel like something more than a simple transaction, were a separate category. In practice, the line between these categories was not always where the law drew it, but the aspiration toward that distinction was real, and over time, within specific communities and under specific social pressures, something recognizably distinct from prostitution did emerge and define itself. By the Meiji period, the Karyukai had its own professional associations, its own training infrastructure, its own social codes, and its own vocabulary for describing what it was and wasn't. Geisha registered with local authorities not as sex workers but as performing artists. Their working hours were tracked, their earnings partially taxed, their movements within the hanamachi governed by regulations that applied to entertainers rather than to the inhabitants of the licensed quarters. This legal framework was imperfect and often porous, but it represented a real claim, one that the women inside the Karyukai made repeatedly and insisted on, that what they did was art, not service. Understanding this distinction matters not because it makes everything clean and simple, it doesn't, but because it changes what you're actually looking at when you look at geisha culture. You're not looking at a system designed purely for the gratification of men, though men's gratification was certainly part of its economy. You're looking at a system in which women developed, preserved, and transmitted serious artistic skills across generations, in which professional reputation was built on demonstrated excellence in those skills, and in which the social world that surrounded the art was complex enough to produce its own literature, its own philosophy of beauty, and its own very particular idea of what a well-spent evening ought to feel like. It was built on inequality. So was every other institution in feudal and early modern Japan. What it built within that inequality was, on its best days, something genuinely worth understanding. Music was non-negotiable. Every geisha learned to play the shamisen, a 3-stringed instrument with a long neck, a drum-like body, and a sound that sits somewhere between a banjo and a sound you make when you stub your toe with deep emotional commitment. The shamisen was played with a large ivory plectrum called a bachi, struck against the strings and the skin of the instrument's body simultaneously, producing a sound that is, once you've heard it, completely unforgettable. Learning to play it was also, by all accounts, genuinely painful. The strings cut into fingers that weren't yet calloused. The proper technique required holding the instrument in a way that no human body naturally wants to hold anything. And the repertoire was vast, dozens of songs to memorize, each one with its own emotional register, its own tempo, its own particular way of demanding your complete attention. The shamisen's body was traditionally covered with cat or dog skin, a detail that tends to land hard with modern listeners and landed perfectly normally within the world that produced it. The skin stretched across the instrument's drum created that characteristic snapping, percussive quality that sits underneath the string sound, a crack at the beginning of a note that gives the shamisen its particular bite. When you played it well, The instrument produced music that felt physically present in a room, that occupied space in a way a quieter instrument didn't. When you played it badly, as beginners invariably did, it produced a sound that politely suggested everyone nearby develop urgent business elsewhere. Lessons began at a young age, before the fingers had the strength they would need, and before the ear had developed the sensitivity required to notice the difference between almost in tune and actually in tune. Your teacher, typically an established master within the Hanamachi's teaching network, would demonstrate, and you would attempt to replicate, and the gap between the demonstration and the replication was the lesson. Nobody softened this gap. Nobody praised the attempt independent of the result. The result was what the lesson was about, and the result at the beginning was always the same: not yet. Calluses were the first achievement. Once the fingertips hardened enough to press the strings without the wire cutting in, a whole layer of discomfort was removed from practice, allowing the more subtle difficulties to become visible. Then the real work began, learning not just the notes, but the dynamics, the spaces between notes, the way a phrase breathes, the specific quality of sound that distinguished a piece played correctly from a piece played correctly but without understanding. The shamisen had a vocabulary beyond its notes, a language of pauses and accents and tonal colour that took years to become fluent in, and which experienced listeners could hear immediately. Alongside the shamisen, trainees learned nagauta, the long song form typically accompanied by the instrument, which added another layer of simultaneous challenge, playing and singing at once, in a vocal style that required training the voice to produce sounds it had never previously been asked for. The nagauta voice sat in a register that was neither speaking nor Western singing, a specific aesthetic that took years to develop, and that, when done well, had the quality of something almost inhuman, too controlled to be ordinary emotion, too specific to be mere technique. Hearing it in a small room, played and sung by someone who'd been doing it for decades, was not an experience you forgot. The shamisen followed a geisha through her entire career. It was the instrument she practiced on her worst days and performed on her best ones. It sat in her room at night, in its case, waiting. It was also the instrument by which she was most precisely judged, because the shamisen required a lifetime of maintenance. The calluses could soften, the ear could drift. The specific physical memory of a phrase could fade if neglected. You never finished learning to play the shamisen. You simply got better or worse at it, and the difference was the quality of your attention, measured every single day. Before you imagine the tea ceremony as a peaceful meditative moment, a small cup, a quiet room, a sense of gentle mindfulness, understand that within the context of geisha training, the tea ceremony was a rigorous physical and intellectual discipline with enough rules to fill several books and enough room for error to fill several more. Every movement was prescribed. The angle of the wrist, the number of times the whisk circled the bowl, where your eyes should be, how you set the cup down, how you picked it up, where you breathed in the sequence of actions and where you most certainly did not. A ceremony performed correctly looked effortless. It looked like a woman simply making tea in a quiet room. This was an illusion that required years to build and could be dismantled in seconds by a single wrong turn of the hand. The tea prepared in the ceremony was matcha, powdered green tea, whisked into hot water with a bamboo whisk until it reached a specific consistency. Frothy on the surface, smooth underneath, a specific shade of green that varied with the quality of the tea and the temperature of the water, both of which the host was responsible for getting right. The bowl itself was selected for the occasion, different bowls for different seasons, different ceremonies, different guests, and its selection was itself a form of communication. A seasonal bowl for a guest who appreciated ceramics was a gesture of attention. Using an inappropriate bowl for a high-status guest was a small catastrophe. dressed up as an oversight, and nobody was fooled. The room's arrangement mattered as much as the performance within it. The tokonoma, the decorative alcove, displayed a hanging scroll and a single flower arrangement, both chosen to reflect the season and the occasion with a kind of precise attentiveness that required knowing simultaneously what the calendar said, what the guest cared about, and what the aesthetic of this particular tea house permitted. The incense burning in the corner contributed a specific mood that would be recalled afterward as part of the memory of the whole event. Nothing was background. Everything was foreground, contributing to an experience whose total effect depended on each component doing its precise share. The movements of the ceremony, the folding of the fukusa cloth, the cleaning of the tea scoop, the warming of the bowl, the measuring of the tea, were choreographed in a sequence so specific that variations between different tea schools were treated with the seriousness of doctrinal differences. You studied within a lineage. Your teacher had studied within a lineage. The movements you were learning had been passed down and refined across generations in a direct chain of embodied knowledge that connected your hands in a practice room in the 20th century to hands that had performed the same sequence in the 17th. This was not mentioned during lessons, but it was present in the seriousness with which every correction was delivered. The guest's role was not passive. Receiving tea in the ceremony also required knowing the correct forms, the correct words, the correct appreciation of the bowl before drinking and after. In the ozashiki context, a geisha performing elements of the tea ceremony for guests was, among other things, testing the room, discovering, gently and without drama, whether the people she was serving had the cultural literacy to receive what she was offering at its proper level. A guest who knew how to receive tea correctly was a guest who understood what kind of evening this was. A guest who didn't was given the same flawless performance regardless, because the performance was not conditional on being appreciated. It was the standard. Whether anyone in the room was equal to it was, in a sense, their problem. Geisha dance, Nihon Buyo, is not the kind of dancing where you feel the music take over your body and you just go with it. That would have been a catastrophic misunderstanding. Nihon Buyo is controlled, precise, and deeply technical, a form that communicates entire narratives through posture, gesture, and the deliberate slowing or withholding of movement. The fan is a prop that becomes a river, a sword, a branch, a letter. The sleeve is a curtain, a veil, a wave. A turn of the head that takes 4 seconds communicates something that would take a paragraph to explain in words. Girls began learning this from childhood, their bodies slowly being trained to speak a language that most people could see but never fully understand, which, when you think about it, describes a great deal of what geisha culture was built on. The foundation of Nihon Buyo was posture, and the posture it required was not the posture a human body finds naturally. The knees were bent slightly, always, a low centre of gravity that kept the movement grounded and close to the earth. The toes turned inward. The shoulders were held back and down in a way that opened the chest while simultaneously suggesting containment. The spine was long. The chin was level. All of this was maintained at all times, not just during the active performance of a piece, but in the transitions, the stillnesses, the moments between movements that were themselves, for an experienced dancer, as carefully composed as anything else. Moving across the floor in Nihon Buyo was not walking. It was a glide that appeared to require no effort and actually required the controlled deployment of muscles that most people don't know they have. The feet never fully left the floor, or appeared not to, the kimono's trailing hem concealing whatever was happening at ankle level, and contributing to the impression that the dancer was floating slightly above the boards, rather than moving along them. Achieving this impression required months of practice in socks on wooden floors, under the eyes of a teacher whose corrections were specific to the millimetre, and delivered without any suggestion that anything other than perfect execution would eventually be acceptable. The repertoire of Nihon Buyo was drawn from a tradition of dance drama. Each piece told a story, expressed a character, inhabited a specific emotional world. You might perform a piece about a grieving woman, or a playful one, or a warrior, or a spirit. You were not, in performing these pieces, expected to feel the emotion you were expressing. That was not the point and would have been considered a misunderstanding of the art. You were expected to produce, through precise physical execution, a form that carried the emotional content independent of your personal state. A dancer who performed grief while feeling completely fine and produced in the audience a genuine experience of something heartbreaking had done her job. A dancer who felt everything deeply and communicated it imprecisely had failed hers. The fan was a world unto itself. Learning the vocabulary of fan movement, the opening that signified dawn, the closing that signified night, the particular arc that traced the flight of a bird, the way it was held at rest to communicate different states of attention, was a sub-curriculum. Within the broader discipline of dance, and mastering it took years beyond simply knowing the pieces it appeared in. A senior dancer's relationship with her fan had the quality of a practiced conversation. No wasted motion, no uncertainty, every gesture landing exactly where it was aimed. Watching it was, even for people with no knowledge of the tradition, unmistakably the product of a lifetime of attention. You could not fake it. You could only earn it slowly in increments so small that some days you could not see the progress at all, until one day someone who knew what they were watching told you that you had it, and you understood, finally, what all the years had been building toward. The ozoshiki, the banquet gathering, was the whole point. Everything you had trained for, every callous and memorized lyric and impeccably tied sash, came down to this: a tatami room, a group of guests seated on cushions, lanterns burning low, and you. The ozoshiki was where geisha performed, yes, but it was also where they talked, played party games, poured drinks, and managed the social temperature of the room with a skill that was honestly something like diplomacy. Knowing when to be funny, when to be quiet, when to redirect a conversation that was heading somewhere uncomfortable, when to pour more sake and when to suggest that perhaps everyone had had enough. These were skills that couldn't be taught in a rehearsal room. They were learned by doing repeatedly in real rooms with real people who were paying for the experience of feeling at ease. The ozoshiki room itself was a carefully calibrated environment. Tatami mats on the floor, paper screens filtering the light, a low lacquered table running the length of the room, the smell of food and incense blending in that particular way that suggested abundance without excess. In winter, a small brazier occupied the centre of the table, not quite enough heat to be genuinely warm, but enough to make warmth feel like a shared project, which was, in its way, the point. Everything in the room was arranged to produce a specific kind of ease, the ease of a man who has left the pressures of his public life at the gate and entered a space where the rules of that life temporarily didn't apply. The tea house, the ochaya, was the institution that hosted the ozoshiki, and its proprietress, the okami-san, was its operational brain. She arranged the guest list, coordinated the geisha through the okiya, managed the menu, and maintained the relationships with both clients and geisha that made the whole mechanism function. A guest who wished to attend an ozoshiki did not simply book a table. He was introduced to the tea house by someone already trusted by it, and his first several evenings were, whether he knew it or not, a form of audition. Behaviour that fell below the expected standard would result in a polite non-recurrence of the invitation. A maiko attending her first ozoshiki was not expected to carry the room. She was expected to be there, present, correct, attentive, and positioned slightly behind her onisan in the physical and social hierarchy of the space. She poured drinks when drinks needed pouring. She participated in party games when invited into them, with an enthusiasm calibrated to the register of the room, energetic enough to feel genuine, controlled enough not to upset the atmosphere. She watched the senior geisha work, filing away every adjustment and decision for the evening when she would be the one making them. The party games, ozashiki asobi, deserve their own mention, because they were genuinely fun in a way that sometimes surprised outsiders who expected the evening to be entirely solemn. These were drinking games, coordination games, guessing games, some specific to individual tea houses, some standard across the karyukai. A popular one involved both hands, a series of gestures, and a rule that changed every round in a way designed to catch the slowest thinker. Losing meant drinking. The geisha participated as full players, not as referees, laughing when the rule caught someone out, accepting the penalty with the same composure with which they accepted everything else. The evening was supposed to be enjoyable. The geisha were there to make it so, and genuine amusement when it happened was not in conflict with the performance. It was the performance. What a well-run ozashiki felt like, to a guest who had attended enough of them to know the difference, was deceptively simple, a very good evening. The food was excellent. The sake was properly warmed. The conversation was interesting. The music was something you would find yourself remembering weeks later, in a different room, unable to explain why. What you were not supposed to notice, what a successful ozashiki specifically concealed, was the quantity of labour and expertise that had produced that simplicity. The seamless appearance of ease was the whole achievement. The years of training, the management of the room, the 100 small decisions made per hour, all of it invisible, all of it exactly as intended. Nothing in the ozashiki was accidental, including who sat where. The positioning of guests, geisha, and the various categories of attendants followed an etiquette so layered and specific that navigating it incorrectly could cause genuine social damage, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, remembered forever and mentioned in whispers kind. Guests were seated according to their status. The most honoured guest received the tokonoma seat, the position nearest the decorative alcove containing a scroll and flowers, and everything radiated out from there in a careful social mathematics. A geisha moving through this room was not simply crossing from one side to another. She was reading the room's invisible architecture at every step, adjusting her behaviour to each person she passed the way a musician adjusts to the acoustics of a hall. The tokonoma seat was the room's spiritual centre. The alcove it faced displayed a hanging scroll, typically ink painting or calligraphy, and a single seasonal flower arrangement that had been chosen that day for this specific occasion. The guest who sat before it was being honoured, and the honour was communicated through placement rather than announcement, which was the preferred method of communicating almost everything in this world. There were no ceremonies of introduction, no trumpeted declarations of importance. There was simply where you sat, which told everyone in the room everything they needed to know about your standing and told you, if you were paying attention, exactly how the evening was organised around you. Junior geisha understood their own spatial position with the same precision. A maiko did not seat herself near the most honoured guest unless specifically invited or directed by her onizan. She occupied the edges of the room's social geography, close enough to participate, positioned to observe, careful not to pull attention toward herself in a way that disturbed the balance that had been established. This was not subservience. It was a reading of the room's needs at a given moment, and understanding those needs accurately was itself a form of skill that the senior women in the room were quietly evaluating. The movement of pouring, filling a guest's cup before it was empty, a practice considered a mark of attentiveness, required constant peripheral awareness. You tracked the cups of every person in your section of the room without appearing to watch them. You moved at the right moment, from the correct angle, with the specific posture that made the act of pouring look like a natural gesture rather than a service transaction. The physical mechanics of pouring sake correctly, 2 hands, specific tilt, specific distance between bottle and cup, were practiced until they required no conscious thought, freeing the attention for the actual task of reading the room. Guests occasionally tested the geometry, whether deliberately or simply, through the natural social expansion that sake encouraged, leaning towards someone across the table, raising their voice above the appropriate register, directing conversation in a way that pulled the evening's energy in one direction at the expense of its balance. A skilled geisha managed these moments with what could only be described as invisible redirection, a well-timed question that moved a conversation back towards safer ground, a slight physical repositioning that changed the dynamic without anyone registering that a correction had been made. It was social architecture performed in real time with no visible blueprints. By the end of the evening, the room's hierarchy had been maintained, every guest had been made to feel appropriately attended to, and the specific social ecosystem of this particular gathering had been navigated without incident. The guests would go home remembering a pleasant evening. They would not remember the 100 decisions that had produced it, which meant every decision had been correct. And tomorrow, in a different room with a different configuration of people, the whole calculation would begin again, from the tokonoma outward, through the invisible mathematics of status and placement, in a spatial language that never needed saying because it was always, perfectly, already understood. Let's address, clearly and carefully, one of the most persistent and most distorted stories about geisha, the mizuage. Historically, mizuage referred to a ceremony marking a maiko's transition to full geisha status, and in certain periods and certain contexts, it involved the auctioning of a young woman's virginity to the highest bidder. This was real. It was also eventually abolished, and the timeline and extent of the practice varied considerably across different regions and historical periods. What popular culture did with this fact was, predictably, not subtle. The nuance that the karyukai was a complex institution with evolving practices across 3 centuries, not a static tableau of exploitation, tends to get lost. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: the lives of women in the flower and willow world range from genuinely coerced and exploitative to surprisingly autonomous, sometimes within the same decade, sometimes within the same district. The word mizuage itself predates the specific practice that made it infamous. In its older usage, it referred simply to the act of a boat unloading its cargo, goods being brought to shore. Applied metaphorically within the karyukai, it acquired its more charged meaning, one that has since been so thoroughly attached to its most extreme historical form that the original breadth of the word has largely vanished from popular understanding. This is common with charged words. The extreme example becomes the definition, and everything else, the variation, the change over time, the contested nature of the practice even within the communities that produced it, gets flattened into a simpler story. In its most documented and most troubling form, mizuage in certain Edo and Meiji period districts involved wealthy patrons paying large sums to the okiya for exclusive access to a maiko at the moment of her transition to full geisha status. The money went largely to the okiya, reducing the young woman's debt in theory, and the practice was formally sanctioned within the licensed entertainment system of the time. It was not hidden. It was listed, negotiated, and treated as a transaction within the okiya's financial ledger, with the same matter-of-factness applied to everything else in that ledger. The matter-of-factness didn't make it less harmful. It made it part of the furniture of the world, which is a different kind of harm. What changed, and why, is a more complicated story than the simple narrative of reform from outside. Pressure from Meiji-era modernizers who wanted Japan to appear civilized to Western observers played a role. The legal restructuring of the licensed entertainment world, which attempted to draw clearer distinctions between performing artists and sex workers, played a role. The gradual shift in how girls entered the karyukai, from family-arranged transactions toward more voluntary entry, particularly in the 20th century, changed the social context within which the practice existed. By the mid-20th century, in the mainstream hanamachi of Kyoto, the practice was no longer standard. What remained was the word, and attached to the word, the story. The distortions most damaging to understanding geisha culture are not the ones that exaggerate a real harm. Those, at least, are pointing at something that actually existed. The more pervasive distortion is the one that takes the practice at its most extreme, applies it universally across all periods and all districts, and then uses it to define the entire institution. By that logic, the centuries of serious artistic training, the preservation of traditional musical and dance forms that would otherwise have been lost, the specific kind of female professional identity that the karyukai produced, all of it becomes merely a frame for exploitation and nothing else. That reduction does its own damage, not to the historical record primarily, but to the actual women whose lives were more complicated than any clean narrative, victim or artist, exploited or empowered, ever fully captured. The truth, as usual, required both more patience and more discomfort than the simplified version, and insisted on being held in its entirety. Back to the ledger, because it never really went away. The economic structure of a geisha's life was built on a system of debt and repayment that could take years, sometimes over a decade, to clear. The okiya advanced the cost of training, clothing, musical instruments and living expenses, and the geisha repaid this through her earnings, which were themselves split between the geisha, the okiya and the tea house where she worked. In theory, once the debt was cleared, a geisha owned her own labour. In practice, the system required navigating a financial relationship with an institution that had a considerable interest in keeping that repayment process moving slowly. A geisha who cleared her debt early was, in one sense, free. She was also, in another sense, no longer the okiya's most reliable source of income. The unit of measurement for a geisha's working time was the senko, a stick of incense. Time at an ozashiki was originally measured by how long a stick of incense burned, roughly 1 hour, and billed at a fixed rate per senko. As the system modernized, the incense was replaced by clocks, but the unit of account remained, and the word stuck, another instance of the karyukai keeping its own vocabulary even as its operational realities changed around it. You were paid in time, and time had a fixed price, and the fixed price was distributed among several institutions before any portion of it reached you. The division of earnings was explicit. The tea house took its percentage for providing the space, the coordination, and the client relationships. The okiya took its percentage for providing the geisha's training, housing, and kimono, the latter being an ongoing expense, since kimono appropriate to different seasons and occasions were required, and could not be worn indefinitely without replacement. What remained after these deductions was the geisha's share, from which the debt accumulated during her training years was repaid on a schedule determined in consultation with the okasan, which is to say, determined by the okasan with the geisha's input noted and considered to whatever degree the okasan considered appropriate. A senior geisha who had cleared her debt and established strong client relationships occupied a genuinely different financial position from a junior one still mid-repayment. A notori, a geisha who had achieved formal certification in her art, could command higher rates. A geisha with a reliable dana had a financial flaw that her unattached colleagues lacked. The economics were stratified, as they tend to be in any profession built on reputation and seniority, and the distance between the top and the bottom of that stratification was considerable. What the money bought, beyond debt reduction, was mobility, limited, carefully bounded, but real. A geisha who had cleared her debt and saved sufficiently could theoretically become independent, renting her own accommodation outside the okiya, maintaining her own wardrobe, managing her own schedule. Some did. This transition, called Notori independence or simply going independent, was the closest thing the flower and willow world had to owning your own business, with all the attendant risks and freedoms that phrase implies. You were no longer protected by the okiya's institutional weight. You were also no longer beholden to it. For some women, the trade was obviously worth making. For others, the security of the okiya's structure, predictable, known, its demands at least familiar, was worth the continued cost. The ledger, once cleared, became your own. Whether that felt like liberation depended entirely on who was holding the pen. At some point in a successful geisha's career, she might acquire a dana, a patron, typically a wealthy older man, who would provide financial support in exchange for something that was officially described as exclusive companionship, and was, in practice, left deliberately undefined in most historical accounts. The dana relationship was not marriage, was not prostitution in the legal sense, and was not quite what any Western vocabulary easily captures. It was a formal arrangement with its own unspoken codes, its own set of obligations on both sides, and its own strange dignity within the world that produced it. The dana paid for the geisha's most expensive kimono. He attended her performances. He was, in a sense, her primary audience, and her most important financial reality, and the nature of what existed between them was a private matter, treated with the kind of public discretion that everybody understood and nobody mentioned. The negotiation that produced a dana relationship was conducted through intermediaries, the okasan, the tea-house proprietress, rather than between the two principals directly, which preserved a formal distance between the personal and the transactional that both parties apparently preferred. A man who wished to become a particular geisha's dana expressed his interest to the tea-house. The tea-house discussed the matter with the okiya. The okiya discussed the matter with the geisha. To what degree her preferences were weighted in the outcome varied by era, by household, and by the specific personalities involved. A formal ceremony marked the beginning of the arrangement, involving exchanged gifts and shared sake. Again, the wedding ritual borrowed for a purpose that was something other than marriage, but required its own equivalent of sacred weight. The dana's financial contributions were specific and considerable. He paid for the most expensive items of a geisha's wardrobe, the grand seasonal kimono, the elaborate kanzashi, the accessories that a working income alone could not support. He might sponsor her participation in the annual odori performances, covering the costs of staging and costuming that fell to individual geisha. In exchange, he had access to her time, her company, her performances, on terms that were exclusive in the sense that she did not accept a different dana while the arrangement held, and preferential in the sense that his requests for her presence at events were accommodated before those of other clients. What the dana arrangements looked like from the inside varied in ways that the public record, predictably, does not fully capture. Some were described by geisha in later memoirs as primarily financial, functional, not unkind, conducted with a mutual professionalism that left both parties reasonably satisfied with the terms. Some were described as genuinely significant relationships, sustained companionship between two people who respected each other across the social and age gap that typically separated them, the intimacy of being genuinely known by someone over many years. Some were described in registers that suggested something between the two, neither purely transactional nor fully emotional, the relationship occupying the specific territory that the Karyukai had apparently created expressly for things that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. The dana system declined through the 20th century, as the economic and social conditions that had sustained it changed. The the category of wealthy men with both the means to maintain a Dana relationship and the cultural literacy to navigate the Karyukai's codes became smaller. The legal and social reforms that redefined the entertainment world also affected the informal arrangements within it. By the post-war period, Dana relationships were rarer, their terms less defined, their social function less central to the geisha economy than they had been in earlier eras. What remained was the word, the memory of the institution, and the occasional contemporary geisha who, in interviews conducted with diplomatic vagueness, described having a patron in terms careful enough to communicate that some version of the arrangement still existed, conducted with the same discretion that had always been its defining characteristic. The hairstyles of a maiko were not hairstyles, they were architectural projects, the most elaborate, the ueshinobu, the ofuku, the yakoshimera, were constructed from the woman's own hair, supplemented with wax combs, pins and ornaments called kanzashi that could weigh several hundred grams when fully assembled. Sleeping in these arrangements required a specific neck support called a takamakura, a small lacquered block placed under the neck to preserve the structure overnight. You did not toss and turn, you did not roll to your side. You slept with the careful rigidity of someone who understood that the alternative was an hour of rebuilding in the morning. The kanzashi themselves changed monthly, marking the seasons, plum blossoms in February, wisteria in May, and so on through the year in a calendar of ornament that connected a woman's head to the passing of time. The construction of a maiko's hairstyle was performed by a specialist, a tokoya-san, a hairdresser who worked exclusively with the geisha of the hanamachi and who visited each maiko at the okiya to dress her hair, typically once a week. In between appointments, the maiko slept on the takamakura and did not wash her hair because washing would require rebuilding the entire structure from scratch before the next appointment. Dry shampoo in the form of powder was applied at the scalp as needed. This was not considered a hardship in any formal sense. It was simply the maintenance cost of a specific aesthetic, which happened to be an aesthetic that required you to treat your head like a display case for 7 days at a time. The takamakura deserves a moment of genuine respect as an object, because it represents an entire philosophy of sleeping compressed into a small lacquered block. Approximately 8 to 10 centimeters high, shaped to cradle the back of the neck, it positioned the head at exactly the angle required to keep the hairstyle intact while technically allowing the body to rest. New Maiko found it miserable for the first weeks, necks aching, sleep fragmentary, mornings arriving before any real rest had occurred. Senior Maiko had adapted completely and slept through the night without incident on a surface that would have been recognizable to most people as not sleeping at all. The human body's capacity for adaptation was, in the hanamachi, put to consistent and creative use. The kanzashi, the ornamental hairpins, were the most visible and most photographed element of the maiko's appearance, and their seasonal rotation gave the hairstyle a calendar dimension that a Western observer might easily miss. Each month brought a new set of ornaments, carefully chosen to correspond to the natural world outside, the camellia of January, the plum of February, the cherry blossom of April, the iris of June, the moon-viewing ornaments of autumn. A maiko in full dress was, among other things, a walking seasonal calendar, her head announcing the month as precisely as any almanac, and considerably more beautifully. Getting the month wrong, wearing the wrong flower, displaying the wrong ornament, was not a small error. It was a failure of the most basic attentiveness to the natural world, and attentiveness to the natural world was foundational to the entire aesthetic. Full geisha wore their own hair in simpler arrangements, or in later periods increasingly used wigs, the shimada wig and others, that could be dressed by the tokoyasan and stored between use, rather than built each week on the scalp. The transition away from the elaborate Maiko hairstyles upon completing training was, by all accounts, experienced with mixed feelings. Relief at being able to sleep normally again, combined with a specific aesthetic loss, the elaborate kanzashi-filled Maiko style being something that turned heads in a way the more restrained Geisha style, for all its elegance, simply did not. You had graduated. Your head reflected it. Whether that was entirely a gain was a matter each woman resolved for herself, typically at 2 a.m. on the first night the Takamakura wasn't there, sleeping as flat and still as a person who has genuinely earned a full night's rest. The Misadashi was the official debut of a Maiko, the ceremony marking the transition from Shikomi trainee to the first public stage of geisha life. It was, by any measure, a significant occasion. The new Maiko was formally introduced to the tea houses of the Hanamachi, accompanied by her Onisan, and would visit each establishment in turn, exchanging the formal gifts and greetings that made the relationship official. For the girl at the centre of it, the Misadashi was also, depending on the account you read, terrifying, exciting and exhausting in approximately equal measure. She was now a public figure in a world with a very long memory. Every performance from here forward would be compared by those who'd seen her debut against every performance that came after. Preparation for the Misadashi began weeks before the ceremony itself. The new Maiko's kimono, her debut ensemble, had been selected, ordered, and fitted during the preceding months. The hair had been arranged in the Shinobu, the first formal Maiko style, decorated with the specific kanzashi appropriate to the season of her debut. The face had been painted, practiced, corrected, and painted again until the result was reliably correct. Every aspect of her appearance on the Misadashi day had been subjected to the Okasan's assessment, the Onisan's evaluation, and the Tokoya-san's professional judgment, and had passed all 3 before the day arrived. The visits themselves, to every tea house in the Hanamachi that the Okiya had a relationship with, were a physical marathon conducted at the measured pace of absolute composure. The new Maiko and her Onisan moved from establishment to establishment, presenting a gift of sweets wrapped in the Okiya's specific paper, exchanging formal greetings with the tea house proprietress and any senior staff present, and receiving in return the tea house's formal acknowledgement of the new relationship. The language used was specific to the occasion, formal to a degree that had been rehearsed, and delivered with a careful pronunciation of someone who understood that first impressions in this world were not first impressions that could be revised later. At each tea house, the new Maiko was observed. This was the point. The proprietresses who received her on Misadashi Day were forming the first version of their professional opinion of her. Note how she walked, how she bowed, how she held herself waiting while her Onisan exchanged greetings, whether she seemed present or seemed to be surviving. The report of the Misadashi travelled through the Hanamachi's network of assessment and comparison faster than the new Maiko moved through its streets, and by the time she'd completed the circuit of visits, the professional community that would host her for the rest of her career had already drawn its initial conclusions. The evening following the Misadashi often included the first formal Ozashiki appearance, the new Maiko's debut in the actual working context for which everything had been preparation. She was there in a supporting role, accompanied by her Onisan, not carrying the room but present in it with a status that had not existed that morning. The guests were often told, with the slight ceremony that the Hanamachi applied to such announcements, that this was her first evening. This was a gift to the room, the mild novelty of a beginning, the pleasure of witnessing an introduction, and the guests received it as such. The new Maiko bowed correctly, poured correctly, spoke when spoken to, and did not, under any circumstances, allow the considerable weight of the occasion to be visible on her face. She had trained for years to get to this room. Now that she was here, the training required her to make it look like she had always been here. And so she did. The question of what happened when a geisha got sick is a useful one, because the answer illuminates something about the entire structure of the profession. The show went on. An engagement at an ozashiki was not the kind of appointment you cancelled because your throat was sore, or your back hurt, or you hadn't slept properly in 3 days. The tea houses had clients who had paid, the okiya had income that depended on appearances, and the geisha herself had a reputation that was built partly on reliability. There were exceptions, genuine emergencies, genuine collapse, but the baseline expectation was that you showed up, you performed, and you dealt with whatever was wrong with your body on your own time in the hours that belonged to you, which were fewer than you would have preferred. The physical demands of a geisha's working life were considerable and cumulative. The correct posture required for an ozashiki sitting Caesar, the formal kneeling position, for hours at a stretch, was genuinely hard on the knees and lower back, particularly for women who'd been practicing it since childhood and whose bodies had absorbed the cost across decades. The dance rehearsals that filled the morning hours, followed by the shamisen practice that filled the afternoon, followed by the evenings in tea houses, followed by the post-engagement responsibilities of removing makeup and kimono and caring for the materials that would need to be perfect again tomorrow. This was a physical schedule that treated the body as a professional instrument and expected it to behave like one, which instruments do until they don't. Colds and minor respiratory illnesses were particularly problematic because the voice, required for nagauta singing, required for conversation, required for the simple social performance of the ozashiki, was affected before anything else. A geisha performing with a compromised voice managed the limitation with whatever combination of steam treatments, herbal remedies, and sheer professional will was available to her. She adjusted her program to avoid the pieces that required her highest notes. She angled her conversation toward topics that didn't require extended speaking. She managed, not because the alternative was unthinkable, but because the alternative had real consequences for the evening's quality, for the tea house's satisfaction, for the okiya's relationship with the client, and she had been trained in a world where managing was the default response to obstacles. The more serious injuries and illnesses, the broken bones from falls in kimono on winter streets, the chronic joint problems that accumulated over years of Caesar and dance, the respiratory conditions that smoky practice rooms contributed to over time, were dealt with in the margins of the schedule rather than as reasons to alter it. Medical care in the Edo and Meiji periods was not of the quality that would have resolved these issues efficiently regardless. What the karyukai offered in place of adequate medical care was a social expectation of continuation that was so thoroughly internalized that many women did not fully register their own pain as a reason to stop until the pain made stopping unavoidable. What sustained the performance through illness was not indifference to suffering. Most accounts make clear that the women of the Hanamachi were not indifferent to each other's difficulties, that the okiya's household relationships included genuine care, and that no Kasan who drove a genuinely sick woman to a working collapse was not only cruel but practically short-sighted. What sustained it was the specific professional identity that geisha culture produced, an identity in which the quality of the performance was inseparable from the quality of the person, in which showing up was both obligation and self-definition. You appeared because appearance was what you were. Staying home because your knee hurt was not a rest day. It was a small failure of the professional self, and the professional self was not a hat you took off at the end of the evening. It was the architecture of who you had become. Within the Hanamachi, relationships between geisha were complicated by the same forces that complicate relationships in any intensely competitive, hierarchical, reputation-based world, which is to say, they were very complicated. There were genuine friendships, deep ones, forged in shared training and shared exhaustion, and the particular intimacy of women who saw each other at their most undone. There was also rivalry, subtle, mostly unspoken, expressed through the language of who got the most engagements, whose kimono was finer, whose dana was more prominent. The Onisan bond created loyalties that sometimes lasted a lifetime. The competition for the same pool of clients created tensions that could quietly poison a house. And because nobody in this world aired grievances loudly, most of it happened in the register of implication, the slightly too long pause, the not quite smile, the impeccably delivered compliment with a small invisible edge. The women of an okiya shared everything: space, meals, rehearsal rooms, the okasan's attention, in proportions that varied with status and seniority, and were therefore never entirely equal. A senior geisha with established client relationships and a reliable dana occupied a different economic and social position within the household than a junior woman still building her reputation, and this difference was present in every room they shared, unspoken but entirely legible to both. The junior woman was aware of it. The senior woman was aware of it. The okasan was aware of it, and managed the resulting dynamic with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything else, not eliminating the tension, because that was impossible, but keeping it at a level that did not damage the household's functioning. Outside the okiya, across the broader community of the hanamachi, the relationships between geisha from different houses were governed by an elaborate etiquette of professional respect that was also, underneath, an ongoing assessment of relative standing. The spring odori performances, the public dance events staged by each hanamachi, were occasions for the community to see and be seen, and what was seen was evaluated. Who had improved, who had declined, whose debut piece had been genuinely distinguished, and whose had been merely competent. These were the conversations of the community, conducted with the discretion that the community required and the precision that long familiarity produced. Genuine closeness, when it existed, had a specific quality that outsiders sometimes found surprising. Women who had trained together through the shikomi years, who had attended each other's misadashi, who had sat together through years of rehearsals and performances and the quiet hours between, these women knew each other at a depth that most professional relationships don't reach. They had seen each other fail, seen each other recover, been present for the private moments that the public performance concealed. The friendship that emerged from that shared history was not the comfortable, uncomplicated kind. It was the kind that knows too much for simplicity, and has decided to remain close anyway, which is a different thing entirely, and, in its way, more durable. What the hanamachi's friendships had in common, the warm ones and the complicated ones, and the ones that were both simultaneously, was the shared language of the world that produced them. Two women who had both trained in the same tradition, both navigated the same hierarchy, both performed in the same rooms for decades, understood each other's lives with a specificity that no outsider, however sympathetic, could fully access. They had read the same room. They had made the same calculations. They had sat in the same silence on the same evenings when the performance was over and the face paint was off and the day had been long, and found in that shared silence something that didn't require explaining, because the other person already knew. That kind of understanding was the flower and willow world's specific and unreplicable gift to the women who lived within it, whatever else it cost them, and the cost was real and various and not to be minimized. It gave them that. Let's talk about the unglamorous logistics, what geisha actually ate, how they actually slept, and what their bodies were quietly going through while they presented their most controlled exterior to the room. The diet was Japanese, seasonal, relatively modest, rice, fish, vegetables, pickles, and there was not much room for personal preference in a household running on a collective schedule. Mealtimes were structured. Portions were not extravagant. The body doing this work, holding perfect posture for hours, playing an instrument that required sustained physical tension, dancing in layered silk in rooms that could be very warm, was a working body with working body needs that the aesthetic framework of the profession had very little patience for. Women managed, they always do. But the gap between how a geisha looked in an ozushiki and how she felt at 2 a.m, back in her room, collar finely loosened, was probably considerable. The Okiya meal schedule was organised around the household's working rhythms rather than around conventional meal times. Breakfast came early, before the morning's practice schedule began. Rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, the standard structure of a Japanese breakfast that varied in detail by season and by what was available but maintained the same basic architecture across months and years. There was nothing wrong with it nutritionally, in the context of a Japanese diet of the period. There was also nothing about it designed to be interesting, because interesting was not the point. Fuel was the point. The body needed to function, and the body was going to function, and breakfast was the mechanism by which that outcome was facilitated. The hours between the morning practice sessions and the evening engagements, the afternoon that might have been, in another life, a rest period, were in practice filled with lessons, fittings, visits, and the various maintenance activities that a geisha's appearance required: nails, hair appointments, the pressing and airing of kimono, the learning of new pieces, the review of old ones. Somewhere in this schedule, a midday meal appeared and was consumed with whatever time was available, which was sometimes adequate and sometimes not. The body's hunger was managed the way most things in this world were managed, acknowledged to the degree necessary for function and not dwelt upon beyond that. Sleep was the resource in shortest supply. Evening engagements ran late, into the early hours of the morning, particularly during festivals and special occasions when the tea houses extended their operation and the clients extended their enjoyment and the geisha extended their performance of enjoyment that may or may not have been genuine depending on the evening and the clients and the specific combination of factors that determined whether a particular night was among the ones you would remember fondly or among the ones you were simply grateful to have survived. Getting home in the small hours, removing the makeup and the kimono and the architecture of the hair arrangement, falling into bed, this was the end of the day. The beginning of the next day's practice schedule came at whatever hour practice began, regardless of when the previous night had ended. What the body accumulated across years of this schedule was a specific kind of tiredness, not the acute tiredness of a single bad night, which the body manages and recovers from, but the chronic background tiredness of a life whose demands consistently slightly exceeded its restoration. Women in the Hanamachi spoke of this in the peripheral ways that people speak of the conditions so thoroughly normalized they no longer register as problems, with wry humor, with the occasional specific complaint about a particular joint or a particular week, with the matter-of-factness of people who have accepted a physical reality and organized their life around accommodating it rather than resolving it. The performance was what it was. The body was what it was. Between the two, a geisha found whatever space remained for something that resembled ordinary rest, and she took it without drama, because there was nothing to be gained from drama, and sleep was too valuable to spend on anything other than sleeping. The men in the room. Who were the clients? The guests at an ozashiki were not random. Access to the tea houses where geisha performed was by introduction only. You needed to be known to the house, vouched for by an existing client, trusted to behave correctly within the codes of this world. This effectively meant that the client base was drawn from a narrow stratum. Wealthy merchants, successful businessmen, politicians, aristocrats, and men who had inherited both money and the social network that came with it. These were not men who needed to impress anyone with loudness or aggression. The code of the ozashiki ran on the opposite principle, an expectation of restraint, wit, and the ability to appreciate what was being offered without grasping at it. This was, among other things, an enormous relief for the geisha, who were dealing with an environment specifically designed to be manageable, in contrast to what the world outside those walls frequently was not. The introduction system was not bureaucratic. There were no applications, no formal reviews, no written criteria. What there was instead was the tea house proprietress, the okami-san, whose judgment about who belonged in her establishment was absolute and exercised continuously. A man came recommended by someone she trusted. He attended his first evening. She observed. Her assessment of whether he understood the codes of the room, whether he received what was offered with the appropriate appreciation, whether he treated the geisha as professionals rather than as props, whether his behaviour at the end of the evening reflected a man who knew where he was, determined whether a second invitation was extended. There were no second chances for first impressions, and no explanations given when they were not extended. The tea house simply became unavailable. What the clients were paying for was not, in the first instance, what most people outside the Karyukai assumed they were paying for. They were paying for an evening of sustained, high-quality social performance, music, dance, conversation, and the specific atmosphere that a skilled geisha generated in a room. This atmosphere was not easily reproducible elsewhere. It required the combination of physical elegance, artistic accomplishment, conversational fluency, and the management of the room's social dynamics that only the Karyukai produced. A man who could achieve this experience elsewhere at a comparable quality would have done so. He came to the tea house because what was offered there was not available anywhere else, and he knew it. The relationship between a regular client and the geisha he attended over many years had a texture that defied simple characterization. He knew her art in its development, had seen her dance in her Maiko years, and in her full geisha years could compare, had opinions. She knew his preferences, which pieces he responded to, which conversation topics animated him, how the evening went best for him specifically. This knowledge, built across time, produced a form of professional intimacy that was genuine without being personal in the way that word usually implies. He was not her friend in the conventional sense. She was not simply a service provider in the conventional sense. They occupied a specific relational category that the Karyukai had created and that existed nowhere else, with its own rules and its own rewards and its own specific way of mattering to both parties without requiring either to define it out loud. The clients also served a social function for each other. The ozoshiki was a place where men of similar standing met in a context stripped of the formal hierarchy of their professional lives, where a politician and a merchant and an old money aristocrat could share an evening on terms that the Karyukai's own codes governed, rather than the codes of the business world or the government. This levelling function was not incidental. It was part of what the tea house sold. The geisha facilitated it by treating every man in the room with the same calibrated attention, refusing to privilege one guest's status over another's in ways that would have imported the outside world's hierarchy into a space specifically designed to leave it at the door. The room had its own rules. The clients accepted them. That acceptance was, in its way, the most expensive thing they paid for all evening. The geisha's year was structured by a calendar of seasonal events, performances, and rituals that tied her life to Kyoto's rhythms in a way that was paradoxically both demanding and beautiful. The spring odori, public dance performances staged by the various hanamachi, were the most visible of these, weeks of rehearsal and performance during which the geisha of a district presented their arts to a paying public audience. There were also memorial ceremonies for great shamisen players, seasonal tea-house gatherings tied to the cherry blossoms or the autumn maples, and the New Year greetings that required visiting every professional contact in the hanamachi, with a kind of structured ritual warmth that took a full day to complete, and left very little room for actual warmth of the unstructured variety. The New Year greeting circuit, called Nengajo in its written form but performed in person in the Hanamachi, began on the first day of January and required a Maiko and a Onisan to visit, in a specific order determined by hierarchy and relationship, every tea house, every okiya, and every teacher with whom they maintained professional connections. At each stop, a formal greeting was delivered, a gift of sweets exchanged, tea accepted and consumed in the correct amount, and the conversation maintained at the register of warmth appropriate to the specific relationship, closer for some houses, more formal for others, the exact calibration different at every door. By the end of the day, the feet hurt. The formal phrases had been delivered perhaps 40 times, and the tea consumed at 20 separate establishments had achieved a cumulative effect that was not entirely comfortable. The circuit was not optional. It was the annual renewal of every professional relationship that mattered, conducted in person, in correct dress, in the first days of the year when everyone was watching. The spring odori were the year's most publicly visible events, and the ones that required the longest preparation. Gionkobu's Miyako Odori, the cherry dance staged annually in April, drew audiences from across Japan and increasingly from abroad. Every geisha and maiko in the district participated. The rehearsal schedule in the weeks preceding the performances consumed the mornings and afternoons of every working day, the choreography refined through repetition until the collective precision of dozens of women moving in coordinated patterns had the quality of a single organism. These were not solo performances. They were ensemble pieces that required each individual to be exactly where she was supposed to be, at exactly the right moment, with the exact quality of attention that her part demanded. A single person, off-tempo or off-placement, was visible in a way that reflected on everyone. The autumn brought the Maiko performances of Gionodori and the other Hanamachis, seasonal dances, each one staged in the specific register of the approaching winter, more reflective, more interior, the colour palette of the kimono shifting toward the deeper tones of the season. Chrysanthemums in the kanzashi, maple leaves in the scroll hung in the tokonoma of the dressing rooms. The aesthetic alignment between the performance and the natural world outside the theatre was not decorative. It was the point, the argument, renewed each season, that the flower and willow world was not separate from the natural order but continuous with it, its beauty reflecting and amplifying the beauty of the world that contained it. Between the major performances, the calendar filled with smaller observances, the Gion Festival in July, with its elaborate float processions through the streets of Kyoto, during which the Hanamachi dressed in yukata and appeared publicly in a register slightly less formal than the ozushiki but more visible than daily life. The moon-viewing gatherings of September, the chrysanthemum ceremonies of October. Each occasion had its dress code, its specific foods, its ritual greetings, and its own small demands on the body and the schedule. The year was a continuous performance, the seasons its acts, and the geisha the constant figure moving through them, adapting her appearance, her repertoire, and the specific quality of her attention to whatever the calendar required, month by month until the year circled back to January and the greeting circuit began again. The erikai, literally turning of the collar, was the ceremony marking the transition from maiko to full geisha, and it was, in a sense, the most significant transformation in the entire trajectory. The white collar of the maiko's kimono facing outward was replaced with a red collar turned inward, a subtle visual signal with an enormous practical meaning. The maiko's elaborate trailing kimono gave way to something more restrained. The heavy dangling obi became an obi tied differently, more controlled. The thick white face makeup was thinned. The junior geisha was officially a professional, She was also in many ways starting over, because while a Maiko's charm was built partly on youth and novelty, and the adorable spectacle of a girl in the process of becoming, a geisha's reputation had to be rebuilt on the sturdier ground of actual skill, actual conversation, and the particular authority that only comes from a woman who no longer needs to perform, being uncertain. The timing of the Erekai was not fixed. It happened when the Okusan determined that the Maiko was ready, a judgment based on the quality of her arts, the depth of her client relationships, her demonstrated ability to hold a room independently, and the less definable quality of maturity that the full geisha role required. Most Maiko underwent the Erekai somewhere between the ages of 18 and 21, but the range was wider than that in practice, and the variation was meaningful. A Maiko who transitioned early was being told that her development had been exceptional. A Maiko whose Erekai was delayed was being given more time, with the understanding that more time was needed, which was a communication delivered without words but received without ambiguity. The ceremony itself was conducted within the okiya, marked by the formal exchange of the collar and witnessed by the household. The new geisha then undertook a circuit of the Hanamachi's tea houses, not unlike the Misadashi visit of her Maiko debut, but with a different register entirely. Where the Misadashi had introduced a girl beginning her journey, the Erika visit introduced a professional declaring her arrival. The tea-house proprietresses who received her were now meeting a peer, someone whose standing in the Karyukai's hierarchy had crossed a threshold, and their acknowledgement of this was communicated in the specific warmth of a professional community welcoming one of its own into full membership. The practical changes that followed the Erekai were immediate and numerous. The face paint lightened, full white coverage gave way to a more refined application, often just the eyes and lips defined. The skin's own quality now part of the aesthetic rather than concealed beneath a white field. The hair was worn in simpler styles, or wigs were used, freeing the woman from the tyranny of the takamakura. The kimono's trailing hem was shortened, the sleeves condensed, the obi tied in the taiko knot that said, quietly and unmistakably, full geisha. She looked suddenly more like herself, whatever that meant, after years of being trained into a specific form. Some women described the Erika as the first time they recognized themselves in a mirror in years. What changed in the Ozashiki was more subtle but more significant. The new geisha now carried the room rather than supporting it. She was the senior figure, initially in name rather than in depth, but growing into the substance of that seniority evening by evening. The conversational demands were greater. The artistic standards applied to her were higher. The tolerance for uncertainty, for the charming awkwardness that a Maiko could deploy as a social asset, had expired. She was expected to be accomplished, to be interesting, to hold the room's attention by the force of what she actually was rather than by the novelty of what she was becoming. She had trained for years to reach this point. Now the point was here, and it turned out to be another beginning, more demanding than the one before it, and offering, in exchange for its demands, something that no previous stage had offered. The room responding to her not as a student or a novelty, but as a master. Here is the skill nobody talks about enough. Talking. Not performance talking, not scripted conversation. Actual, responsive, intelligent, calibrated conversation with strangers in a context where everything depended on the quality of the room's social atmosphere. A geisha was expected to be interesting, to know enough about current events, literature, local gossip, and the particular interests of regular clients to hold a conversation that made the evening feel alive. She was also expected to be interested, or to perform being interested so well that the distinction didn't matter. She had to remember names, remember past conversations, remember what a client had said 2 months ago that had made him laugh, and deploy that memory at the right moment with the casualness of someone who simply happened to recall it. This was not a skill that appeared fully formed. It was built from hundreds of evenings in rooms where the penalty for getting it wrong was a reputation that preceded you. The conversational training that Geisha received was not the kind that came with a syllabus. Nobody sat you down and said, "Here is how to redirect an uncomfortable topic. Here is how to disagree with a guest without disagreeing with him. Here is how to make a man feel that his observation about poetry was brilliant when it was merely adequate." These were skills acquired through observation and practice in live rooms, with consequences for failure that were real and immediate and socially recorded. You watched your Onisan navigate a conversation that was heading somewhere inadvisable, watched the specific moment she introduced a new topic, the lightness with which she did it, the way the room barely noticed the correction, and you filed it away under the working category of things you would need to do yourself one day, and had better understand before then. The range of knowledge required was genuinely broad. A geisha who could only discuss the arts was a geisha whose conversational reach was limited to clients who wanted to discuss the arts, which was not all of them, and not all of the time. The Hanamachi had an informal educational culture. Women read, discussed, kept current with the news and the developments of the broader world in ways that the formal structure of their training didn't explicitly require, but that the actual demands of their working life made necessary. A client who wanted to talk about politics expected a conversational partner, not a listener. A client who was excited about something in the news expected it to be known, or for the not knowing to be managed with enough wit that it became its own kind of exchange. You could not fake encyclopedic knowledge. You could fake genuine curiosity well enough to get through most evenings, and genuine curiosity practiced across years had a way of becoming indistinguishable from the real thing. What geisha were absolutely not permitted to do, and this was a code enforced by social pressure rather than written rule, was carry the content of the ozashiki outside it. The conversations that happened in the tea house stayed in the tea house. A client who said something unguarded in the relaxed atmosphere of the ozashiki about his business, his politics, his marriages, his anxieties, was trusting the discretion of the room. The discretion of the room was the geisha's professional responsibility, and it was taken seriously in the way that all professional responsibilities in this world were taken seriously. Not because the rules said so, but because the world was small, the memory was long, and a geisha whose discretion was questioned would find the rooms that had been open to her quietly, permanently closed. The humour was important and consistently underestimated. A geisha who could make the room laugh, genuinely, not performatively, was a geisha whose evenings were remembered differently than those of women with equal technical skill and less wit. The humour of the ozashiki was dry rather than broad, built on timing and implication rather than explicit jokes, finding the slightly absurd angle on ordinary things rather than reaching for anything that required explanation. It was the humour of people who'd been paying attention, delivered by women who'd been trained to notice everything and given enough time and enough rooms to have developed very precise opinions about the material the world provided. Getting it right required knowing the room, knowing the moment, and having spent enough years in enough evenings to trust your own judgment about both. Most nights you were right. The nights you misjudged it were the ones you remembered longest and remembered most usefully. A Maiko's career was, by definition, short. The elaborate youth-specific styling, the trailing hem, the junior status, these belonged to a window of time that closed, typically, somewhere in the early to mid-20s. What came after, the full geisha career, was longer and quieter and more complicated. Some geisha became senior figures in the Hanamachi, deeply respected, with client relationships spanning decades. Some married. Geisha were traditionally expected to retire upon marriage, since the profession and domestic wifehood were considered incompatible. Though this convention was navigated in various ways across different eras, some became okusan themselves, running their own okiya, and in doing so stepped from one side of the ledger to the other, from the woman whose costs were being tracked to the woman doing the tracking. The arc of a full geisha's career had its own rhythm, distinct from the more dramatic trajectory of the Maiko years. The early years as new geisha were years of consolidation, building the client relationships that would sustain the career, deepening the artistic skills that the Maiko period had established but not completed, developing the conversational authority and social presence that full professional standing required. These were not glamorous years in the way that the Maiko debut had been glamorous. They were working years, the kind that accumulate invisibly and produce over time the depth that audiences and clients could feel but not always name. The middle years, a geisha in her 30s, established, known, were by many accounts the richest. The debt typically had been cleared. The client relationships were deep and reliable. The arts had reached a quality that beginners couldn't achieve and that only decades of practice produced. A senior geisha playing the shamisen in her late 30s played it differently than she had played it at 22, not just better in the technical sense, but with a kind of understanding that showed in the phrasing, in the choice of dynamics, in the way she inhabited the music rather than executing it. Audiences who knew the difference heard it immediately. Those who didn't still felt something they couldn't explain, which was the same thing arriving through a different entrance. The question of marriage and retirement was navigated differently across different eras and different individuals. In the strict traditional model, a geisha who chose to marry withdrew from the profession entirely. The two identities were considered incompatible, the domestic wife and the professional entertainer occupying roles whose demands and social positions could not be held simultaneously. Some women accepted this. Some negotiated arrangements that the formal code didn't quite acknowledge, but that the hanamachi's practical tolerance allowed. Some chose the profession over marriage with the deliberateness of a decision rather than the passivity of circumstances, understanding clearly what they were choosing and choosing it anyway, because what the Karyukai offered them was a professional identity and a form of life that domestic marriage in their era and social position did not. The women who became okasan, who took over the running of an okiya, underwent the most complete transformation available within the system, from the managed to the manager, from the woman in the ledger to the woman holding the pen. This transition required not only the accumulated knowledge of the profession, but a specific temperament, the ability to evaluate talent without sentiment, to maintain financial discipline without cruelty, to hold the household together across the competing interests of women at different stages of the same difficult career. The best okasan were described by the geisha, who trained under them in terms that were complex and warm and honest about the complexity. Women who were demanding because they understood exactly what was being demanded of the women they trained, and who could afford to be hard on the details because they had spent their own careers learning why the details were worth being hard on. Not all geisha were the same, which sounds obvious, but turns out to matter considerably once you look closely. Kyoto's geisha, called geiko in the local dialect, were considered the standard bearers of the tradition, the most rigorously trained, the most technically accomplished, the most attached to the formal lineage of the art. Tokyo's geisha operated within a somewhat different cultural context, less attached to the ancient court traditions of Kyoto, more influenced by the merchant culture and rapid modernization of the Meiji and Taisho periods. Visitors often noticed the difference immediately. Kyoto was slower, more formal, more interested in whether you were doing things correctly. Tokyo was a little more flexible on the details if the evening was going well. Neither was wrong. They were simply the products of different cities with different histories and different ideas about what the flower and willow world was ultimately for. Kyoto's identity as the imperial capital, the seat of the emperor, the center of court culture, the city where Japanese aesthetic traditions had been developing and refining themselves for over 1,000 years, shaped the hanamachi in ways that went beyond simple geography. The Geisha of Gyeonkobu trained within a tradition that traced itself back to the entertainment districts of the 17th century, with lineages of teachers and performance styles that were documented, maintained, and treated as living historical inheritance. When a Geisha of Gyeonkobu performed a dance, she was performing within a chain of transmission that connected her body, in the present, to the bodies of women who had performed the same piece generations before. This was not metaphor. It was the actual mechanism by which the tradition was preserved. Tokyo's geisha world, centered in the Shimbashi and Akasaka districts among others, had a different atmosphere that reflected the city's different character. Edo, the city that became Tokyo, had been the commercial and political capital of the Tokugawa shogunate, a city of merchants, samurai administrators, and the rapid cultural productivity that proximity to power and money tends to generate. The geisha who emerged from this environment were, by reputation, sharper-tongued, quicker, more willing to engage with contemporary culture and contemporary humour, qualities that reflected the faster pace and more commercial sensibility of the city that produced them. An evening in Tokyo's Hanamachi was, by general accounts, slightly less like a ceremony and slightly more like a very good party, which was not a lesser achievement but a different one. The terminology itself marked the distinction. Geiko, the Kyoto word, carried the specific weight of the classical tradition. Geisha, the word used in Tokyo and eventually adopted universally in Western usage, was slightly more general, less bound to the specific artistic lineage of any single tradition. Within Japan, the distinction between Geiko and geisha was meaningful to those inside the world and invisible to those outside it, which is probably the appropriate distribution of a distinction that mattered primarily in professional contexts. The two traditions regarded each other with the particular mixture of respect and competitive assessment that tends to characterize different schools of any serious art. Kyoto acknowledged Tokyo's commercial vitality and the quality of its individual practitioners. Tokyo acknowledged Kyoto's technical rigor and its historical depth. Neither acknowledged the other as simply better, because neither believed it, and both had sufficient evidence for the position they occupied. What they shared, the shamisen, the dance forms, the ozashiki structure, the specific professional identity of the woman who stood at the center of it, was larger than what divided them. But the division was real, and within the world that produced it, it was taken seriously, as all the important distinctions in this world were taken seriously, without drama, without announcement, with the calm precision of people who have always known exactly where they stood. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan's rapid, deliberate modernization after centuries of relative isolation, was, for the geisha world, both a threat and a strange kind of opportunity. On one hand, the Western-facing government of the Meiji period looked at the Karyokai and saw something that seemed, by the standards of European civilization it was trying to impress, difficult to explain politely. On the other hand, the Hanamachi were deeply embedded in the economic and social fabric of Japan's major cities, and the men now running the country were in many cases also the men attending ozashiki. The result was a series of regulations, reforms and legal distinctions between licensed entertainment and licensed prostitution that reshaped the flower and willow world without quite dismantling it. The geisha survived the Meiji era. They also emerged from it somewhat different than they had entered it. The Meiji government's project was breathtaking in its ambition and ruthless in its execution. Within a generation, Japan dismantled the feudal structure of the Tokugawa period, adopted Western legal codes, restructured its military on Prussian and British models, established a constitutional government, and sent its brightest young men to Europe and America to study whatever their home country had not yet learned. The driving anxiety behind all of it was a specific fear that the Western powers, who had forced Japan open to trade at gunpoint in the 1850s, would find sufficient excuse to colonize it unless Japan demonstrated quickly that it was a civilized nation by Western standards. Civilization by Western standards had a list of requirements. The licensed entertainment districts, with their complicated arrangements and their centuries-old traditions of female professional life, were not on the list. The reforms that affected the Karyukai were not simple or uniform. The Prostitution Emancipation Act of 1872, the Geisha and Prostitutes Liberation Act in its fuller name, was intended to free women from the debt bondage that characterized the worst elements of both the licensed quarters and, to a degree, the geisha system. In practice, it was implemented unevenly, interpreted differently across different regions, and navigated by the okiya and tea-house system with a combination of legal compliance and practical continuity that preserved the essential structures while adjusting their visible form. The geisha debt system was modified rather than abolished. The distinction between performing artist and sex worker was formalized in law rather than simply assumed in practice. The Karyukai acquired, for the first time, a legal identity that distinguished it formally from the licensed prostitution districts, a distinction that served both the women inside it and the government that now had to explain the institution to foreign visitors. What the Meiji era gave the geisha world, paradoxically, was a new kind of prestige. In a Japan actively performing modernity for Western audiences, the geisha became one of the images of Japan that foreigners encountered and carried home, enigmatic, elegant, traditionally Japanese in a way that the suit-wearing modernizers of the new government were not. Foreign dignitaries were entertained in tea-houses. Photographs of geisha appeared in Western publications as images of the exotic East. The institution that the Meiji government had been mildly embarrassed by became, in the hands of the tourism and diplomacy apparatus, an asset, something distinctively Japanese, ancient, beautiful, and unlike anything the West produced. The geisha survived modernity partly by becoming its symbol. The American occupation of Japan after World War II produced for the geisha world a confusion so thorough that it echoes in Western misunderstanding to this day. American soldiers, encountering Japanese women in traditional dress, sometimes encountered the actual geisha of the hanamachi, but far more often encountered a different category of woman entirely, the pan-pan girl, a sex worker catering specifically to occupying forces, sometimes dressed in an approximation of traditional clothing for the same reason anyone puts on a costume. The conflation was immediate, natural from a certain ignorant distance, and catastrophically persistent. The word geisha entered the English language wearing the wrong definition, and no amount of subsequent correction has entirely fixed it. Back in Kyoto's hanamachi, the actual geisha watched the occupation, adapted where they had to, and continued training as they always had, in the rooms and traditions that the war had damaged but not destroyed. The war years had been genuinely difficult for the Karyukai in ways that the occupation compounded. The hanamachi had been affected by the broader mobilization of Japan's economy for the war effort. Materials were scarce, silk for kimono subject to wartime restrictions, the wealthy client base depleted by the demands of the conflict. Some tea houses had closed temporarily or permanently. Some okiya had contracted. The elaborate material culture of the flower and willow world, dependent on fine fabric, skilled craft workers, and the leisure economy of the wealthy, had been exactly the kind of thing a wartime government could not prioritize and actively found embarrassing as evidence of peacetime excess. The hanamachi had survived, reduced, waiting. The occupation brought different challenges. General MacArthur's administration, in its reforming ambition, looked at the licensed entertainment and prostitution system of Japan and saw a problem, both a moral problem by the values the occupation brought with it, and a practical one, as the intermingling of American soldiers with sex workers created public health and public relations difficulties. The prostitution prevention law that followed in 1956 abolishing licensed prostitution swept away the legal framework that had governed the pleasure quarters for centuries. The karyukai, positioned, now with decades of legal documentation behind it, as a distinct institution of performing arts, survived this reorganization as it had survived earlier ones, by being demonstrably something other than what was being abolished. What could not be so easily managed was the reputational damage of the conflation in Western minds. Books published in America and Europe about the occupation often blurred or ignored the distinction between geisha and sex workers. Films reinforced the image of the geisha as a figure of erotic availability. The white face and kimono read as signals of a specific kind of transaction. The 1950s and 1960s produced a wave of Western cultural product, novels, films, magazine features, in which the geisha appeared as a romantic and sexual figure whose primary function was the entertainment of men in ways that the actual karyukai would have found unrecognizable. The women of the hanamachi, continuing to practice their arts in the same rooms and by the same codes as before, had no mechanism for correcting an image being constructed thousands of miles away by people who had never been to Kyoto and had no particular interest in accuracy. The misunderstanding settled in, became conventional, and waited, as misunderstandings tend to do, for someone to take the trouble to untangle it. The question of choice, whether girls and women in the geisha world chose their lives or had those lives chosen for them, is one that honest history has to sit with rather than resolve quickly. In earlier centuries, girls were often sold to okiya by families in poverty, the transaction dressed up in the language of opportunity and a better future. The debt system ensured that even if the initial entry was nominally voluntary, the exit was financially complicated. By the 20th century, the picture had shifted. Girls in the post-war period were more likely to choose the profession deliberately, attracted by the artistry and the prestige of a world that was by then visibly diminishing, and therefore in the specific way that vanishing things become beautiful, more romantically charged than it had ever been in its prime. Leaving was possible. It was complicated. It required clearing the debt, negotiating the social exit, and walking away from the only identity most of these women had built since childhood. The debt was the first barrier, and in earlier periods the most formidable one. A girl who had entered the okiya at 11 or 12 and trained for 5 years before beginning to work had accumulated a debt that her early working years would only begin to address. The calculation was structural, designed, as all debt structures are, to make repayment possible but not quick, sustainable but not accelerating. A woman who wished to leave before clearing the debt faced the same problem that faces anyone trying to exit an arrangement that is simultaneously the source of the income that would fund the exit. The math did not cooperate. She needed money to leave and needed to stay to earn the money, and the staying produced more costs that extended the timeline, and the timeline was the point. Beyond the financial barrier was the social one, which in many ways was more durable. A woman who had entered the karyukai as a child had no other professional identity. She had not attended ordinary school past a certain age. She had not developed relationships outside the hanamachi in the way that women who moved freely through broader society had. She had no resume in the conventional sense, no network beyond the flower and willow world, no credentials that translated outside it. Walking away from the okiya meant walking away from the only context in which she had standing, the only world in which her specific skills, her reputation, her network of relationships, and her professional identity were recognized as valuable. Outside that world, she was a woman with unusual accomplishments and no obvious place to use them. The women who left successfully, and some did, at every period, tended to fall into recognizable patterns. Some married into situations that provided financial security and social status sufficient to replace what the karyukai had offered. Some leveraged their reputations and client networks into independent businesses, tea ceremony instruction, traditional dance teaching, the running of restaurants or establishments that served the same wealthy clientele in a different register. Some simply disappeared into ordinary life, choosing the anonymity of a conventional existence with the deliberateness of someone who had spent years at the center of other people's attention and found she preferred the edges. The Hanamachi had a long memory for everyone who'd been part of it. Whether that memory followed a woman who left as warmth or as judgment depended on the circumstances of her departure and the specific quality of the relationship she'd maintained. Leaving gracefully, debt cleared, relationships properly concluded, the Okasan's blessing, something close to genuine, was not just possible. It was the only exit that the Karyukai's codes permitted to be called an exit rather than an escape. Today, the number of active geisha in Japan is estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2,000, a fraction of the tens of thousands who worked in Kyoto's Hanamachi, alone at the profession's height in the early 20th century. The Hanamachi still exist, the tea houses still operate, the apprenticeships still run on schedules that would be recognizable to a girl who entered the same system 100 years ago. What has changed is the context. A modern Japan that no longer relies on the flower and willow world as its primary form of elite entertainment. A younger generation less interested in a decade of rigid training. A global audience that finally, slowly, is beginning to understand what it's actually looking at. The geisha who remain are, in a quiet way, the custodians of something, not a relic, but a form of knowledge that exists nowhere else, encoded in movement and music and the exact angle of a collar, kept alive by women who chose to keep it alive. The decline in numbers has been gradual, and then, in certain periods, sudden. The post-war decades saw the first steep reduction. The economic conditions that had sustained the Hanamachi during the Meiji and Taisho golden years didn't return in the same form. The wealthy patrons of the pre-war period were replaced by a different kind of prosperity that expressed itself differently, and the young women who might have entered the okiya found, for the first time in the profession's history, that other paths were genuinely available to them. Women could now study at universities, pursue professional careers, earn their own money in ways that did not require the specific bargain of the Karyukai. The Hanamachi did not close, but it contracted. What has kept the Hanamachi alive, in the face of this sustained reduction, is a combination of genuine commitment from the women who remain within it, and the specific economic value of cultural heritage in a Japan that has increasingly recognized traditional arts as worth preserving. Government support for traditional performing arts, the prestige value of geiko culture in Kyoto's tourism economy, and the continued existence of a client community, smaller than before, older, increasingly composed of people who understand and value what they are attending, have maintained the institutional infrastructure within which individual training and practice can still occur. The okiya that remain are fewer and smaller. The tea houses that still host ozashiki represent a reduction from their peak numbers. But the system, in its essential form, persists. The women who enter the profession today do so with a full understanding of what they are choosing. The only entry mode available in an era when the information exists, the alternatives are real, and the choice is, to a degree that no previous period could claim, genuinely free. They choose the years of training, the debt, the discipline, the specific life that the Karyukai produces. Because the art is real, and the tradition is real, and there is something in the flower and willow world that cannot be reproduced by any other means. They walk the same lanes of Gion that women have walked for 3 centuries. They play the shamisen in rooms where the same pieces have been played by hands long gone. They paint their faces white in the mornings and remove the paint in the evenings and in between inhabit, for a few hours, something that exists at the exact intersection of art and life and memory and performance. in a form so specific that losing it would be losing something irreplaceable. The last geisha, whenever she comes, will not announce herself. She will simply be the last woman to tie the obi in the particular way that the Karyokai taught, the last to play the shamisen in the specific tradition of Gion Kobu, the last to walk the stone lanes at dusk with the purposeful composure that the Hanamachi produced and nowhere else could. She will not know she is last. She will simply do what geisha have always done: arrive at the room, read the room, and perform for whatever audience is there, with everything she has been taught and everything she has become, completely, without reservation, and without requiring anyone in the room to understand exactly what it cost. So tonight, as you lie in whatever comfortable arrangement you've managed, pillow correctly positioned, blanket at the precise temperature, no one correcting your posture, consider what you've just travelled through. A world built entirely on the perfection of small things. A world where the angle of a wrist and the timing of a laugh and the exact weight of a silence were not decorative details, but the whole substance of a life's work. You spent an evening in the flower and willow world, and you didn't have to wake up at 5 a.m. to practice the shamisen, which, given everything we've covered, is probably the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The geisha carried something that is genuinely difficult to name and genuinely worth trying to. They carried the conviction that beauty, in music, in movement, in the quality of a conversation, in the specific atmosphere of a well-run room was serious work, not decoration, not performance in the dismissive sense of the word, but labour as real and as demanding as any other, requiring a lifetime of attention and producing at its best something that the people in the room carried home with them and found, weeks later, still present somewhere at the back of their minds. They built this conviction in early mornings and late nights, and years of repetition in practice rooms that nobody outside the Hanamachi ever saw. They built it in the Shikomi years, on the cold floor of a genkan they swept twice. They built it in the careful arc of a fan, practiced until it required no thought, until the thought had become the body, and the body had become the art. They lived lives that were constrained in ways we would not choose and could not accept, and within those constraints they found, or built, which is a different and more accurate verb, a form of excellence so specific and so complete that it has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the more remarkable things the human capacity for discipline and devotion has ever produced. A tradition of serious women doing serious work in beautiful rooms, across 3 centuries, in a language of gesture and music and presence that most of the world never learned to read. The numbers are smaller now. The lanes of Gion are quieter than they were. But the lanterns still come on at dusk, and somewhere in a practice room above a narrow street in Kyoto, someone is playing the shamisen tonight. The same notes that have been played in the same tradition for generations, by hands that understood, as all the hands before them understood, that the point was never to finish learning. The point was to keep going, to show up, to fill the room with something worth being in, to do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as the art required it, and the body permitted it, and the tradition needed someone to carry it forward into the next quiet evening. So take a breath. Let the shamisen notes settle. Let the white-faced figures of Gion dissolve back into the history they came from. You're in your clean bed, in a warm room, under no obligation to sweep anything or memorize anything, or sit in Caesar for 3 hours while performing perfect composure. That is a luxury your ancestors would have found genuinely astonishing. Receive it with the gratitude it deserves. Sleep well. The lanterns are still burning on the stone lanes. The music is still playing in the practice rooms above the city. And somewhere in the long, patient tradition of the flower and willow world, a woman is reading a room she has read 100 times before, and finding in it, still, something worth doing beautifully.